I kicked off today debating if I wanted to put another locked door to seal off, part of the second floor of the house. That way, a certain, part of the game would be more effective. But I didn't want to, keep continuously cutting off the player's movement and making them, like have to search around for items and things and keys. After some debating, I decided that I would come back to it later when there were less pressing things to work on. I realized that one of the items needed for the true ending was accessible through the walls along with the note that was attached to it. So I had to shrink the note a little bit and move the item's location just a little bit more because I was too lazy to do it the proper way and deal with their collision boxes and hit boxes that you wouldn't be able to grab into the wall. Since I was already there, I decided to, just do some simple modeling in one of the secret areas that is required to get the true ending. I didn't have red rope mesh, so I decided just to go, with the cylinder that I made red and maneuvered around the room to make it kind of look like a red string. After that, I decided it was time to work on the maze collision. The enemy would constantly be getting stuck on each other, and on the corners of the maze. They basically had like a painted road where they could walk on, but they really only see the road, not if there's something sticking out at head height. It's like when they would walk into that, they wouldn't notice, and they would continue to keep trying to walk as if there was an obstacle. The way I made the maze is that it's a collection of a handful of moving parts and a lot more complex geometry that has outcrops and overhangs to give it a bit more of a cave feel. Problem with doing that is that I had inadvertently made a ton of small obstacles that weren't on their road. Little parts of the maze would stick out, and they would occasionally get caught on one and stuck there. I had made the maze and converted it into a static mesh a long time ago, and it took a while. I'm not redoing the maze. After searching around online, to see if there was any way that I could make it so that the enemy can basically ignore the collisions of the maze walls, but still keep the collisions with everything else in the world. I was presented with just a few like discussion forums that weren't even about the same thing, but they popped up in the search bar because they had the word collision in them. So if I couldn't find a legit way to do this, I was going to do it my way, which is just brute forcing it until it works. I then spent the next hour or two going through the maze and adding nav mesh modifiers to pretty much every corner. These modifiers were basically like big erasers. You can think of it like that. That would just erase the road, sort of, so they wouldn't, the enemy wouldn't be able to follow that part anymore. Kind of like boundary bumpers or buffers, I guess. I placed them mostly around corners, to make the bots' road that they could follow, more narrow. But at the same time, it would also make that road further from the walls, which would then, like they'd be less likely to get caught on stuff sticking out of them. But that did limit their, movement in terms of like how dynamic they could look while running around. But it seemed to fix the problem of them getting stuck on the walls, so I was satisfied with that. Although I haven't gone into further testing of that yet. The next problem was getting the bots to not get stuck on each other. The way they move is that they try to take the shortest route from point A to point B. So they spend a lot of time, just like hugging the walls. So if two were to collide from opposite directions, it would basically be stuck on each other, and they wouldn't go around each other because they were trying to take the shortest route. So they would be stuck in a staring contest basically forever. This went back to the maze wall problem because it was essentially the same thing. They wouldn't see each other since they weren't like really on the road, but rather following it. It's like a whole little thing. When you place, never mind. I juggled around a few ideas that I was thinking about, like making a system so that if their location remained unchanged for like a certain amount of time, it would end their navigation code and start it up again, but pick a new location for them to roam to. I tried this out, but as I was setting it up, I was thinking that even if they are stuck to each other, they're still slightly moving because of their like little idle animation. They're kind of like bobbing from side to side. My plan was just use their exact coordinates, but when I put in the code to show their coordinates, it was showing that they were technically, as I was thinking, they were technically still moving, but it was just 0.00001 pixels just back and forth. So overall, their location wasn't changing, but to the game, it technically was changing. I was hoping it would be easy and I could just do something like, if location didn't change for X time, then restart. But since it was technically changing, I couldn't do that. And I didn't want to dedicate brain power to make some sort of like janky system that would get an average of their location or make like a bubble around a certain value of their location. So I just decided to go back to trying to find a way to remove their collisions, but only from a specific target. I could get rid of their collisions entirely, which would fix the problem, but then that also made the problem that they would not have collisions with the floor and they would fall into the abyss. To better test the collisions, I decided to lock two of these numbskulls into a small corner of the maze and just kind of was fiddling about with the multiple different collision settings and presets. Nothing came of it. I didn't want to accidentally mess up the code, so I made a second version of him to test this on. But pretty quickly, I gave up on that because I knew that, if it worked, I would just use this guy instead, and I would have a duplicate, and I would get them mixed up and have extra files on my computer. So I went back to experimenting on the main guy. I was trying to make it so that they would ignore collisions with anything in the pawn class because I set both of them to pawns, but that didn't really work. So I went back to the internet, continuing to try to find an answer, but eventually I came across a random single comment in some discussion forum from like 6 years ago that mentioned something about using the overlap instead of ignore. I went back to my annoying little monsters and fiddled around with their overlap settings, but to no one's surprise, didn't work. That was until for whatever reason I decided to set their like collision settings so the game thinks that they're vehicles and not creatures. And that worked. They passed through each other, and I wasn't entirely sure why at first, but when I got it to work, I immediately tried to set them back to pawns, and did the same thing. I didn't think anything like bad was gonna happen, if I left the game thinking of them as vehicles, but I didn't want to like risk it. When I went back to pawns, the problem came back and they ran into each other and got stuck again. After a little more fiddling around, I figured out that they were both considered to be. Actually, you know what? Forget it. I don't really understand what happened in this next part or how I got it to work. I was clicking buttons. Things worked. Yeah, here's them working. Anyway, the AI would now be able to pass through each other. Then I had to test this with the player. They would still collide with the player and kill the player, but they would also still get their ankles broken if you juke them out, and would be stuck running in place for all of eternity, or until you walk back in their line of sight again. I'll have to work on applying the vehicle collision thing to the walls and make it so it's not actually a vehicle, but I'm done with all that confusing stuff, so I'm going to do that another time. So that's my first devlog video. My idea to start this happened way after I'd already started the production of this little game, so most of the like crazy and interesting stuff is all done, so can't really do a devlog from the start for this, so I'm just gonna pick it up from where I currently am. This is only the first half of what I did today. I don't feel like turning the second half into a devlog at the moment. That'll be tomorrow's project.